Hello, the Ukrainian Review has a second interview with Per Nyholm. Per Nyholm is a Danish journalist who, for a couple of years, live in Austria. We talk about the future of Ukraine after the war against the Ukraine. So, we talk about the politics, we talk about the values, because Ukraine now defends the European values. Per Nyholm is a journalist from Denmark who lived for a long time in Austria. So he came not the first time to Ukraine. So what is your impression this time? In Europe, many people say that they are tired of this war. Are you feel this tired of the war in Ukraine itself? So what is your impression on this visit?
I am, as always, almost always, an optimist. As a matter of fact, I am very optimistic on behalf of Ukraine. I am very optimistic on behalf of Europe. I am certainly optimistic about seeing Ukraine as an inseparable part of Ukraine. We have certain problems with this because we are accustomed to seeing Ukraine as part of an Eastern Empire. It will take time for the West to realize that Ukraine is and was always a part of Europe, a part of the West, but was taken prisoner by this Eastern Empire, which is now once again attacking Ukraine and therefore attacking Europe and the West. We have politicians, not many. We have a public opinion, not large, in Western Europe, which is skeptical about what can be achieved in Ukraine. But I think I should say that the vast majority of the public opinion and of the leadership in the West, also in Western Europe, is fully aware of what is happening in Ukraine and is supporting Ukraine because they know they are supporting themselves. What we hear of skeptics are exceptions, but it is one of the weaknesses of the press, to which I belong, of course, and of many intellectuals. They want to be pessimistic. They think that the commodity they have sells better if they predict disasters and catastrophes. As a matter of fact, I have been, a political observer, you might say, in Western Europe for the last 50 years. And I have been coming and going in Ukraine since 1988. I am convinced that we shall get through this. When I look back on the development we have had in Europe and the West since, say, the Second World War, where most of Europe were in ruins, where this country here was in ruins, where Europeans could not be together in the same room without hating each other. We are now having a Europe which is partly united and will go on uniting better and better. We have rebuilt Europe, we have welfare states, we have democracy, we have an affluence that we have not had before. This is also the case here, although now the Russians, the imperial power, the dying imperial power, is trying to destroy its former colony. I don't think it will succeed. I think what we are seeing now, I see it certainly at the end of one more journey through Ukraine, the strategic balance in Ukraine is slightly changing. The Russians are no more attacking, they are defending. The Ukrainians are attacking, not as well as we could hope, but this is because mostly the armaments that we need from the West is not arriving the way it should, which is a scandal and a disaster. But even in this situation, the Ukrainians are holding their own, and more than that, they are pressing the Russians. The war is now changing. The character of the war is changing. We are coming into a situation where the Russians are going slowly back, trying to keep what they have. The Ukrainians are moving forward, slowly, but also consolidating what they have. This is the great change, and that makes me optimistic.
Could you say that this war is only the one way to prolong the Russian Federation or the Russian Empire, as you say? So the war is only the one way to existence of this state. They wanted to conquer the countries, neighbor countries,
Yes.
like Georgia in
Sure.
2008, like Ukraine from the 2014. So the war is only the one way to existence of this country.
I think you are right on that. And I think the Russians will fail.
The second question, will be the Russian Federation after this war the existential threat for the Europe?
Well, this is the great question that we are facing. What I think we are seeing, and I think we can see it if we look at our history in the way that other empires, so to say, retreated. It takes time, it's painful. You look at the way that the British left their empire, you look at the way that the French left their empire, the Dutch, etc. Even Denmark, we had a very small empire. It takes time for the empire to realize that it is not there anymore, that it has to turn into a kind of national state. In the West, we have generally succeeded with that. The Russians have not realized that yet. And they are fighting, I think, a struggle which will end with their defeat, should end with their defeat, because if the Russian Empire, knowing no borders, continue to live, it will remain a threat not only to Ukraine but to the rest of Europe. So we all have to concentrate on beating this empire, and the rest of Europe should be grateful to the Ukrainians for taking this responsibility upon themselves. Ukraine is now what the Poles were before, the forward defense of the West of democracy. And the strategic goal in this war must be the disappearance not only of the Russian Federation as we know it of now, but of Russia as some kind of an imperial leftover. My feeling is that towards the end of this war, we should see the dissolution of the Russian Federation. We should already now encourage the many nations we have inside the present Russian Federation, which is really just another name for a Russian empire. There are dozens of viable nations inside the present frontiers of the Russian Federation. I imagine we could easily have anything between 10 and 15 independent sovereign republics on the stretch from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific.
Is it not a Pandora box open because it's a lot of a nation inside of the European state? For example, you researched the Spain and the situation between the Spain as a state and, for example, the state of the Basques.
Spain is a little bit of a parallel to Russia, Ukraine.
Could you compare this to...
Well, I mean, first of all, as Ukraine was conquered mostly by Peter the Great after the Battle of Poltava, so just a few years later, in 1714, the War of the Spanish Succession ended with, you might say, a French victory, so that the Bourbons from France took over Spain and the old ruling dynasty of the Habsburgers had to leave. And Catalonia lost its freedom and was turned into a kind of colony of a new Spanish central power, into which you also had the South American colonies. But they were away from the central state, and therefore it was more natural for them to leave. We have difficulties in realizing that Catalonia is a colony, just as Ukraine was a colony of Russia. So, I mean, the thing is, Spain is now anchored solidly within NATO and the EU. And the government in Madrid sometimes for good, sometimes for worse, has to abide to the laws of Europe. This is a situation we don't have in Ukraine, but this is the situation we try to establish. And I don't see that a dissolution of the... Why should a dissolution of the Russian Empire be more of a threat to Europe or to stability in general than, say, the dissolution of the French or the English Empire? We are living within our, so to say, traditions, our old-fashioned thinking. Everybody would think in the 80s that if the Soviet Union breaks down, we shall have a great chaos. Well, we didn't. We got a better Europe out of it. We got a better world out of it. We have now many more democratic states in Eastern Europe than we had. We have a war now, but this is because the Federation of Russia will not accept the historical and political realities. And this concept that we have power over other people must go. That will create stability. I think it would be fine if we have, say, 10 or 15 sovereign states, as I said, between the Baltic and the Pacific. They will be relatively small. They are manageable. They might develop their own identities. That does not mean that Russia will disappear. Russia is also suffering from the Russian Federation and the gangsters ruling in the Kremlin. We need a nice Russian state, maybe
National state.
National state, concentrated on, for example, Moscow. I don't know what's going to happen to the St. Petersburg area. They could form their own republic, as a matter of fact. I don't know what's going to happen to Kaliningrad. All that can go. And then we would still have a Russia of about, what, 80 million people, 100 million people. It would be a substantial state, but it would not be a threat to anybody else. There would be a balance, a new balance of power, maybe equal even to the balance of power which emerged after 1945 in Western Europe between the new states. I think it would be a blessing for all of us, including the Russians, if the whole thing goes.
Yeah, sure, but it's a very hard question how to change the mentality of the people. So now, if you trust some Russian polls, the 80% of the population, they support this special military operation, the war called in Russia. So how change millions of people, their opinion upon this war? Because, you know, maybe it's a question what to do Europeans and Americans after the Second World War with the Nazi Germany. It's like the denazify Nazi Germany, so now we need to deputify the population of the Russia. But it's a question of the values. So you underline in many of your interviews and your publications that Ukraine defend the European values. Yeah, and why do not Europeans support Ukraine for the 100%? So, for example, Austria, Switzerland, they bond to military aid to Ukraine. So a lot of the political parties in Germany, in Slovakia, even in Poland now, they refuse to send weapons to Ukraine because Ukraine need a weapon. So, for example, yesterday was a tragedy in the Kharkiv region, and more than 50 people they died as a result of the Russian attack. So, why do Europeans say about the values, but not to support Ukraine to defend these values on the territory of Ukraine?
I think it's a very good question, and I think that one could give a very short answer to it. It's a scandal that Europe, the rest of Europe, does not support Ukraine completely. And we should not even discuss with the Ukrainians what they need and what kind of tactics they should use on the battlefield. This should all be left in the hands of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians, with enormous costs, are defending all of us. We cannot morally and ethically defend, for example, the attitude of the Germans. I think, especially considering what happened yesterday, once again it was demonstrated that the Ukrainians are paying an enormous price. And there we have the German Chancellor Scholz. In this connection a scandal, saying that they cannot yet deliver the Taurus missiles, which you need. That we cannot yet, it is coming, but it's always coming too late, the F-16 jets that you need for the defense of your airspace and your villages. I simply don't understand it, except you say this is part of the old-fashioned thinking. We don't want a bigger war. Well, if we had said, everybody had taken a bigger war a year and a half ago, this war would have been finished by now. And we may even have had a completely new geopolitical and strategic situation in the East. Now we have, as a matter of fact, a situation where the war could spiral out of control. We are not yet there. But if we allow the ruling gangsters in the Kremlin to go on thinking that they can win, of course, there will be more fighting, more death, more destruction. We have to make quite clear, and as soon as absolutely possible, that we will support the Ukrainians with everything that they need here and now, so that over the winter we can have a breakthrough in the direction of the east and in the direction of the south, and make sure that the Russians realize they are losing this war. But you were talking about bringing up the Russians to think in another way. This is going to be extremely difficult. It's a very long-term project, and I'm not even sure we can succeed of that. I don't think we should live in any illusion that we can have a democratic Russia, or say a number of democratic nations, nation states in the federation, in the territory of the federation. But we could still have what I would call manageable nation states. I mean, we have Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, etc. now. They are not democratic in our sense, but they don't constitute a danger either. They have their own political system. Let them have that. The Russians have their own political system, which reflects their past, the Mongol invasion and thinking that they still have. They do not need to be perfect democracies. I couldn't care. I only want to be in a situation where they are not a danger to our civilization and culture. That I think is manageable.
Yeah, sure. But it's a question of the nuclear power, of course. But let me turn to another kind of the war, because the war not only on the front lines, but it's just a war of minds. So how to attract the people in Europe to understand that this situation is very dangerous for them? Because even you published in one article that the young population in Denmark, they don't want to read news, to spend time and to understand the information, the analytics, so they are out of this theme. Is this really dangerous that the people, the young population in Europe, they have no interest in the politics at all? They have no interest in such very difficult questions. It's not for fun, it's just not entertainment, but it's need to analyze, it's need to focus upon the very hard questions like the war and peace, like the values, like the European Union, like the stability, and so on and so on. What is your point of view? How attract the young population to understand that after a few decades it's just a question, will be the Europe in this form or not?
Well, it is true that the young generation does not take the same interest as you and I, for example, would take in these affairs. They are brought up in a climate of welfare and peace. They want entertainment. They just want to be left on their own. In a sense, it's natural. It is true also that they don't read newspapers to the degree I think they should read newspapers, and which is a kind of responsibility which follows from the fact that we have democracy and free speech and all that. But we have to live with that, and we have to hope that as they get on with their lives, they will become more and more interested, engaged in what is happening. I am not very pessimistic on this. I see also among the youngsters, they are maybe worried. They don't want to have the unpleasant experience of going into finding out what is actually happening. But they are aware that something is happening. I think they will mature. I had the pleasure yesterday of talking to a class of young journalist students at the university here in Odessa. We had a long discussion about how do we engage readers in the press. We are moving away, I think, from the paper form of the daily newspaper. We are going into the internet. I know very little about that. I am a bit worried about it. I really don't like it, but I think it's the future. We can engage people in this. My own newspaper in Denmark is now switching, I think, mostly from the paper into the internet, quite in order to attract young people. We shall see if it succeeds. I am going back to Denmark later in this month. I am making a Ukraine evening in the headquarters of our newspaper. It is sold out already now, which means 200 seats in our auditorium has been sold, not given away, sold for money. And that shows an interest. There will be many young people there, that I know already, schools and higher educational institutions and so on. People coming in from the street. There is a lot of interest. The thing is, it's very complicated to understand. But I think if we try to emphasize the message, this is a threat not only to a faraway Eastern European country, but to our civilization. Not only to, say, the West European state, including Denmark, which is very much exposed because of its geographical position, where it controls the waters through which the Russian Baltic fleet must pass through to get into the open sea. Denmark is very exposed. The Danes know this. So, but of course, I mean, you are a young Spanish person or Portuguese person, or you live in California. It is difficult. And this is where it is important that journalists from abroad come to Ukraine. And if I may say so, although this time I think I have been received very, very well, there were enormous bureaucratic, what are we saying, problems along the road. Especially the war effort. I understand security must come first, but I would recommend that the armed forces make it easier for journalists to work here. There's too much bureaucracy, many documents in no ending stream. Insecurity, can you make it or can you not make it? Should you invest in it or should you not? It should be possible for the armed forces to issue journalists in whom they have confidence with a press card. And then, I'm not saying all the doors should be open, but then the bureaucracy should be finished. And it should be possible to communicate with local press centers and simply say, we want this, this and that, and they can say, you cannot do that, you cannot do this. But again, I mean, they want descriptions, they want photos, and all this. This is a hindrance. Ukraine must be sure that its public information machinery works. Because in the West we cannot do very much about that. This is very much a Ukrainian business. Ukraine has enormous sympathy abroad, but they should be careful not to lose it. I mean, nobody wants to go through the Russian way of bureaucracy. The Russians have lost this battle a long while ago. But to the degree where we have, you might say, Russian traditions in the way of thinking towards the press, towards information, that must go from here.
Yeah, thank you very much for this conversation. And very last question, in what terms you can describe the Ukrainian victory?
I had a very nice, interesting conversation yesterday with General Marchenko. We met somewhere here in the south. He was in a very civilian-looking building. He's very difficult to trace, I would think. And way into this building, in a small, very cramped office, there he was. I have met him before. I'm a great admirer of him. He gave me a wonderful interview a year and a half ago to a book I published. And I wanted to go back and give him the book and thank him. We talked a little bit. And he said, because I said, of course, okay, I mean, there are people, not many, in the West talking about negotiations and compromises and all that. And he repeated what he said the first time. We cannot negotiate until every Russian soldier has left Ukrainian territory. I think it's also a warning maybe to whoever politicians are around or forces who are around in Ukraine thinking in terms of compromise. He said quite clearly, no negotiations until they are out. What that should be, we don't know then. I don't think anybody should interfere from the outside, or for that matter, with the inside maybe. It's a completely Ukrainian matter. Where do we belong? Neutral, NATO, EU. Who are we? We should not try to convince the Ukrainians to be, say, French or Danish or Italian or whatever. The Ukrainians are a natural entity which has a right to decide exactly their allies, their friends, their cultural institutions, all this. So, saying goodbye, the general said, I said to the general, next year we will meet in the Crimea. He said, yes, next year we will have a coffee in Yalta. That's where it should end.
Yeah, it's very good forecast, and thank you for this conversation, and thank you for the cooperation with the Ukrainian Review, and I hope we just continue this conversation maybe in the Crimea or maybe elsewhere in the Ukraine.
We could meet all, we will have a coffee.
Yeah, sure.
In the Yalta next year. Great.
Let it be.
I am so happy working for you. It's a pleasure.